This week, we're going to look at the role age plays when we're learning a new language, and then some of the strategies and background information we need to know about language and learning in general, and then specific to students. First, we're going to look at what we know about the role age plays in this idea of a critical period. Then we're going to briefly look at what are the 5 stages we go through when we learn a new language. These are the same across individuals and languages. Some of the communication strategies kids use, adults may use too. It's not limited to kids, but we may see them more in kids. Then, what strategies do kids employ to compensate when there's a lack of knowledge? Also, what are some of the individual factors that influence our ability to acquire the new language? This idea of is there an age that's the cutoff line between being able to successfully learn a new language or not? Oftentimes, people say that kids just naturally learn language better, and there's some truth to that. But it's a little bit more complex, and one of the big stories or research projects that revealed a lot was this story of Jeannie. You may have seen Jeannie the Wild Child in maybe an ed psych class. Jeannie was a big deal in terms of linguists looking at what happens to the brain when we are desocialized and we don't have exposure to language. She was a really big case and adds something to the argument about is there an age. You can see more if you look at this YouTube link. After you've watched Jeannie, you're going to have to come up with your own conclusions about age. But I think the big takeaway is that in early adolescence, there's a kind of pre-adolescent stage. It's going to be different for different learners, but around age 12 seems to be a cutoff point. I think they found Jeannie when she was 13. In addition to the cognitive interaction needed for language, there is this need for socialization, exposure to language, and a biological component. When we look at Jeannie's story, not having socialization changed her ability to express herself and to even pick up on language, to understand others, and to express herself. Fundamentally, there are these 5 stages that we go through. I think especially for those of you working in early elementary school, but really across the board, because you could have students who are newcomers even in high school that have very little exposure to language, your students are going to have a silent period. This is kind of a misnomer, and it clashes with our cultural expectation in the United States, where we want students speaking, we want them producing. In this early silent stage, there's lots of production going on through this reception of all the input around us. It's a very, very rich stage for acquisition. I think the key takeaway for us as teachers is to recognize that this is a very, very rich time frame, and we have to respect this silent period. For some students, it could take a few weeks, and for some, it could extend into years based on personality and other factors that we'll look at in a few minutes. As you would expect, especially when considering speaking early production, language develops from just one word, maybe just one syllable. Then once you start to emerge as a speaker, you're starting to put words together into a kind of grammar, and you're able to create and express more meaning. Then, of course, you develop an intermediate and then advanced level of fluency. An advanced level means you have full control of the language. You understand the nuances of the language, you can play with the vocabulary and the idioms, and you can hold a conversation on most topics that are age-specific. We're going to talk a little bit about the strategies we all tend to demonstrate when we're learning a new language. The first is lexical avoidance. You're speaking a second language and you're searching for that word you don't know. You don't know the word, so you replace it with a word you do know. We call this lexical avoidance. You don't know the word, so you kind of work your way around it. If you want to say, I got lost, which is actually kind of difficult, almost idiomatic, you might say, I lost my road. Literally, you have lost your road. Phonological avoidance is when you avoid certain sounds. I know with speaking Spanish, I struggled with a trilled R, and for years I would avoid words that involved R's that I had troubles with. Another example, Korean speakers often have a hard time with consonant and vowel combinations. So they might want to say the word sheet, but they avoid it because it often comes out as something else. This has been true for many of my Latino students as well. Topical avoidance is when you don't feel comfortable with your language repertoire on a certain topic. Dr. Gilhooly is another professor at UCM who has worked with Karen refugees. He worked with a couple of brothers, and the younger brother felt more confident, was willing to take more risks, and acquired language much more easily. The older brother, sure, struggled much more, even into adulthood. Dr. Gilhooly would ask him each week about his classes, and the older brother would avoid talking about this economics class. Dr. Gilhooly eventually discovered that the brother really had no idea what economics was. He knew generally from sitting in there and picking up a little bit that it was about money, but he would avoid it because he didn't feel confident that he had the language to be able to talk about it. As teachers, we have to see this at play and help students connect the dots. Likewise, there are strategies we do to kind of overcompensate or to communicate and compensate for what we don't know. Another strategy we all use is circumlocution, even in our first language. With circumlocution, you don't know the word, so you kind of talk around it. You're trying to express, what's that word, money holder? You're trying to say wallet. This is very common. I remember when I was studying French and I didn't know a word in a oral proficiency interview. I told my professor, there's this box made out of glass that has fish in it. Turns out the word aquarium is the same word in French, but I didn't know that word. As teachers, we can help. We have to listen to what our students are doing. I think we do this naturally anyway, but it's a strategy that students employ modifying or approximating words. Students might not know the word canoe, but they know the word boat, or they know the word ship. So we might say small, small ship to indicate canoe. Again, as teachers, we need to see it and recognize it and help students fill in the gap. A new word coinage is something we do in our L1. We construct new words when we don't know what the word is. For example, we might say airball for a balloon, or house hat for a roof. This is a good thing. This means the student is attempting and uttering, speaking, and it's a good thing, a positive thing. We just need to help students connect the dots. We do this all the time. I know I do code switching. Maybe I don't know the word in Spanish, so I'll put in an English word. Me gustaría hamburger. Actually, it's hamburguesa. But I will substitute a word I don't know with my own word. And then one I've kind of included here is what I call the yes man or yes woman oftentimes. We learn the strategy to avoid the spotlight on us by just saying yes to everything, or students do this. You'll see this especially with younger students. They don't want to be under the spotlight, so they just say yes to everything. We have to make sure that their facial expressions and their production backs up whether they actually understand or not. There's two big factors in terms of language learning that have to always be considered. We as teachers have to accommodate or create situations where attitude and motivation are high. This goes back to Krashen. With the affective filter, we want students to feel comfortable. We want their attitude and experience with the language to be positive. If a child's first experience in his school, his first experience with English is so negative, it can really set back the language development. We know this can be modified. We know that by nurturing and respecting the silent period, that attitude can modify over time. But we also know that it can persist if a student has that negative attitude. Going back to those two brothers, the older brother's attitude was always quite negative because he was always below his younger brother. He never won the games they would play in class. He knew he was less of an English speaker than his brother, and that's persisted into adulthood. Again, this is something that they can learn. We as teachers can help in the process, and it's the same with motivation. We need the students to have not only the emotion to learn the language, but to take school seriously and to feel that they can succeed. We need to create things within what we do in the classroom that interest them, that speak to their own interests and their own experiences. This is, to me, the biggest factor in terms of whether we see students succeed or not. What is their motivation? Where is it coming from? And how are teachers supporting it? Too often we lump every language learner into the same category. While there are commonalities, there's no question that there are strategies that are demonstrated, but at the end of the day, there are huge discrepancies in terms of personality and talent, intelligence, motivation, background, and memory. You're going to have to look at all of the things listed here. I can see certain things in each of the columns from each of the theorists that I agree with, so it's really up to you to see what is in this individual child that's either keeping them from learning or that is promoting the acquisition of English. On another level, it comes down to what we do and what we help students do to develop metacognitive strategies, cognitive strategies, and social affective strategies. With metacognition, we need to help them begin to organize words, ideas, and concepts just as we do in the early grades. This needs to be something they do in the early stages so they have a good foundation and can make connections. They need to learn how to prepare for a reading, and we as teachers need to model that for them. They need to be able to know how to organize themselves because this will lend itself to easier relationships with the language. Just look at these different strategies. See how they resonate with you in terms of what we can do as teachers, what we can have students do. When you look at those cognitive strategies, it's so important for language learners that they have a sense of context when they're looking at something or hearing something. That they know what's contextual to us as Americans may not be contextual for them. Language learners often just give the simple bare-bone answer, but they need to be able to elaborate ideas. This is a process. Cognition can come by how they're grouped and how they're sharing knowledge. I'm a huge proponent that students learn best from their peers. The research shows that teachers are down on the list. Peers are highest on the list. So all of these are skills we teach first language students and native speaking Americans. They are critical for the social, academic, and language development of our culturally and linguistically diverse students. That's it for this week. The key points: think about age, think about Jeannie's story. What does it tell you as a teacher, as a human being that's a student of language? Think about the ideas of the stages we go through and what we can do to respect that silent period and help students make the steps that they need. Consider the strategies that are used and never forget the individual differences that make us all have different competencies in our ability to communicate. We're also different, and we can't lump every single language learner into the same basket. We need to know who they are as a complete human being. That's it for this week. See you again next week.